Hi, I'm the guy who smiled politely while my in-laws called me mediocre at their mansion dinner table, the one who nodded when they said I'd never amount to anything substantial. They had no idea I just signed the papers to buy their failing empire 3 hours before dessert was served. When Patricia, my mother-in-law, toasted to family success that night, she was unknowingly celebrating the man who now owned everything they'd built over 30 years. They thought I was just another middle management nobody married to their precious daughter. What they discovered next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up to the Chamberlain estate always made my hands tighten on the steering wheel, not because of the winding road or the intimidating iron gates, but because of what waited beyond them. Another evening of subtle insults wrapped in silk pleasantries, another dinner where I'd be reminded of my place in their carefully constructed hierarchy. My wife Sarah sat beside me, adjusting her pearls in the vanity mirror, the same pearls her mother had given her for our wedding, with the comment that they were family heirlooms for family members who understand tradition. The mansion rose before us like something from a period drama, all Georgian columns and manicured lawns that probably cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. William Chamberlain had built this monument to success brick by brick, starting with a small textile operation in the 1970s and growing it into Chamberlain Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate that once employed half the county. The driveway curved past fountains and topiary gardens, each detail designed to remind visitors that they were entering a world where old money still mattered. I parked my modest sedan between William's Jaguar and Patricia's pristine Mercedes, feeling the familiar pang of being outclassed before I'd even stepped out. Sarah squeezed my hand as we walked toward the front entrance, her way of acknowledging what we both knew was coming. These monthly dinners weren't about family bonding, they were performance reviews, opportunities for her parents to assess whether their daughter had married beneath her station and to remind me of the gulf between my background and theirs. The butler, an elderly man named Harrison who'd worked for the family longer than I'd been alive, greeted us at the door with the kind of polite smile reserved for necessary but unwelcome guests. The foyer gleamed with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, family portraits of stern-faced Chamberlains lining the walls like judges presiding over a court. Each painting seemed to whisper the same message: you don't belong here. Patricia emerged from the drawing room in a cloud of expensive perfume and carefully applied authority. She air-kissed Sarah's cheeks and offered me a handshake that lasted exactly long enough to be polite but not long enough to suggest warmth. Her gray hair was pulled back in the kind of sophisticated updo that probably required a weekly salon appointment, and her black cocktail dress was understated in the way that only truly expensive clothing could be. "Michael," she said, my name sounding like an assessment rather than a greeting. "How lovely to see you again. I trust work has been treating you well." The question carried the familiar undertone that suggested she already knew the answer and found it wanting. In her world, success was measured by the size of your estate, the exclusivity of your club memberships, and whether your accomplishments were the kind that appeared in the society pages. My position as a regional operations manager at a mid-sized logistics company registered somewhere between invisible and disappointing on her scale of worthwhile pursuits. William appeared from his study, a glass of whiskey already in hand and the bearing of a man accustomed to commanding rooms simply by entering them. At 72, he still carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to accommodate the slight paunch that came with decades of business lunches and board meetings. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm enough to remind me that despite his age, he remained formidable. "Michael, good to see you," he said with the kind of hearty enthusiasm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was just telling Harrison about the old days when men built things with their hands and understood the value of real work. Not like today's generation, always looking for shortcuts and easy answers." The comment wasn't directed at me specifically, but it didn't need to be. We all understood the subtext. Sarah shot me a warning glance as we followed them into the dining room. The table was set with china that probably predated the Civil War, crystal glasses that caught the light from the overhead chandelier, and silverware heavy enough to be used as weapons. Fresh flowers from the garden created centerpieces that were beautiful in their restraint, everything carefully arranged to suggest effortless elegance while requiring enormous effort to maintain. The first course arrived as we settled into our seats, something involving pears and prosciutto that I couldn't pronounce correctly if my life depended on it. Conversation flowed around topics I'd learned to navigate over the years: the state of Patricia's garden club, William's concerns about the changing business climate, Sarah's volunteer work at the children's hospital. I contributed when appropriate, offering observations that were thoughtful enough to show I was paying attention but never bold enough to suggest I considered myself an equal participant. "You know," Patricia said as the salad plates were cleared away, "Margaret Henderson was telling me about her son-in-law's promotion at the bank. He's been made vice president. Can you imagine? At his age, some people just have that natural instinct for advancement, I suppose." She didn't look at me when she said it, but the message was clear. Some people had instincts for advancement, and others, like me, apparently did not. William nodded approvingly. "Banking's a solid field, traditional, respected. Not like some of these modern industries where success is so volatile and unpredictable." He cut into his beef with precise movements, each gesture reinforcing his point. "I've always believed that a man's career should reflect his character. Steady growth, proven results, the kind of trajectory that speaks to substance rather than flash." I smiled and agreed, playing my assigned role in this familiar theater. They weren't wrong about the value of steady growth and proven results. What they didn't understand was that success could take forms they'd never learned to recognize. While they measured achievement in terms of job titles and social standing, I'd been measuring it in terms of opportunity and timing. While they saw my career as evidence of limited ambition, I'd been using it to learn how businesses really operated, from the ground up. The main course conversation turned to family history, another well-worn territory where I could listen respectfully while William recounted stories of building Chamberlain Industries from nothing. He'd started with a single textile mill inherited from his father, then expanded into manufacturing, real estate, and a dozen other ventures that had made the family wealthy beyond most people's dreams. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd created something lasting, something that would endure long after he was gone. "The key to building a dynasty," he said, gesturing with his fork for emphasis, "is understanding that every decision has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. You can't think quarter to quarter, or even year to year. You have to think in terms of decades, generations. That's what separates those who create lasting value from those who simply punch a time clock." Patricia murmured agreement while Sarah tried to steer the conversation towards safer ground, but William was warming to one of his favorite themes. "Take our current situation with the company for instance. We're facing some challenges certainly, but they're temporary setbacks in a much larger story. The market is volatile, regulations are constantly changing, and there's more competition than ever. But Chamberlain Industries has weathered storms before, we'll weather this one too." I knew more about their storms than they realized. The challenges William mentioned so casually were actually existential threats to everything they'd built. Chamberlain Industries was hemorrhaging money at a rate that would have terrified them if they'd understood the full scope of their problems. Orders were down 40% from the previous year, 3 major clients had terminated contracts, and their debt service was consuming an increasingly large percentage of their revenue. The company that had once dominated their industry was dying slowly, and the family either didn't see it or refused to acknowledge it. What they definitely didn't see was that I'd been watching their decline with the careful attention of someone who understood both the crisis and the opportunity it represented. While they'd been hosting charity galas and attending country club events, I'd been studying their financial statements, analyzing their market position, and identifying the assets that would retain value even if the company itself collapsed. My background in logistics had taught me to see inefficiencies and bottlenecks that others missed, and Chamberlain Industries was riddled with both. The dessert course arrived with the usual flourish, some elaborate creation involving chocolate and berries that probably required half a day to prepare. Patricia complimented the chef's work and made a comment about the importance of maintaining standards, even when times were challenging. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were worried about maintaining the quality of their dinner party desserts while their business empire crumbled around them. "Michael," Williams said, turning his attention to me with the kind of sudden focus that usually preceded uncomfortable questions, "what's your perspective on the current economic climate? I imagine someone in your position sees things differently than those of us who've been insulated by family resources." The question was framed as curiosity, but it carried the familiar undertone of condescension. In Williams' worldview, my perspective was interesting primarily because it represented the viewpoint of ordinary people, those who hadn't been blessed with inherited advantages and had to navigate the world without safety nets. I was the working-class voice at their privileged table, useful for providing insight into how the other half lived but not particularly relevant to their own circumstances. I think we're in a period of significant transition, I replied carefully. Industries that seemed untouchable a decade ago are being disrupted by new technologies and changing consumer preferences. Companies that don't adapt quickly enough often find themselves left behind, regardless of their historical success. Patricia nodded politely, but I could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she found my analysis presumptuous. Of course, some companies have resources and expertise that provide natural protection against market volatility, she said. Family businesses with deep roots and diversified holdings aren't as vulnerable as smaller operations that lack that foundation. She was talking about Chamberlain Industries, naturally, but her confidence was based on outdated information and wishful thinking. The diversified holdings she mentioned were actually liabilities now, spreading their losses across multiple failing ventures instead of concentrating their remaining strengths in areas where they might still compete effectively. The deep roots she valued so highly had become anchors dragging them down, preventing the kind of radical changes that might have saved the company. William raised his glass in a toast, the gesture carrying all the ceremonial weight of a family patriarch blessing his domain. To family success, he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never seriously contemplated failure. To the continuation of traditions that have served us well, and to the wisdom that comes from understanding our place in the world. We all raised our glasses and drank, but the wine tasted bitter to me, not because of its quality, which was undoubtedly excellent, but because of the context. 3 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in a conference room downtown, signing the final documents that made me the new owner of Chamberlain Industries. The family that was toasting their continued success had unknowingly invited their new boss to dinner. The acquisition had been in the works for months, coordinated through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles that obscured my involvement until the very last moment. I'd used every contact I'd developed over 15 years in the logistics industry, called in favors from former colleagues who'd moved into finance and consulting, and leveraged my knowledge of the Chamberlain's operations to structure a deal that gave me control while minimizing my personal risk. The irony was that my supposedly mediocre career had been perfect preparation for this moment. While working in logistics, I'd learned how supply chains really functioned, where inefficiencies created opportunity, and how to identify assets that were undervalued by their current owner. I'd seen enough struggling companies to recognize the patterns that preceded collapse, and I'd watched enough successful turnarounds to understand what separated salvation from failure. More importantly, my position had given me access to information that the Chamberlains themselves didn't possess. As a regional operations manager, I'd worked with dozens of manufacturers and distributors, many of whom had dealings with Chamberlain Industries. I'd heard the complaints about delayed deliveries, quality control problems, and pricing that was no longer competitive. I'd seen the contracts that weren't being renewed and the bids that were being rejected. While the Chamberlains were insulated by layers of management and optimistic reporting, I was getting raw data from the marketplace. The conversation at dinner moved on to other topics, but I found myself only half listening. Part of my attention was focused on maintaining my role as the polite but unremarkable son-in-law, while the other part was already thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. Owning Chamberlain was only the first step. Actually turning the company around would require decisions that would probably horrify the family that had built it. Sarah caught my eye across the table, and I realized I'd been quiet for too long. She was used to my tendency to withdraw during these dinners, but tonight felt different even to her. I smiled and made an appropriate comment about the meal, then excused myself to use the restroom. I needed a moment to process what had just happened, to let the reality of my new situation sink in properly. The guest bathroom was decorated with the same understated elegance as the rest of the house, all marble surfaces and antique fixtures that probably cost more than my monthly salary. I stared at myself in the mirror, looking for some sign that I'd changed, that becoming the owner of a major company had somehow altered my appearance. The same ordinary face looked back at me, the same brown hair that never quite stayed properly styled, the same unremarkable features that had always made me easy to overlook. But something had changed, even if it wasn't visible. For the first time in my adult life, I held real power, the kind that could reshape lives and redefine relationships. The knowledge was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Tomorrow morning, I would need to start making decisions that would affect hundreds of employees, multiple communities, and the family that had just spent the evening reminding me of my limitations. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation had shifted to Sarah's recent volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. She was describing a new fundraising initiative with the kind of genuine passion that had first attracted me to her 8 years ago. Patricia and William listened with the appropriate level of interest, proud of their daughter's charitable commitments, but also subtly reinforcing that this was the kind of meaningful work appropriate for someone of her background. "It's wonderful that you're able to contribute your time," Patricia said. "Not everyone has the luxury of pursuing causes they're passionate about rather than simply working for financial necessity." Another subtle dig at my career, delivered with the kind of skilled precision that made confrontation impossible without seeming oversensitive. I wondered how long it would take them to understand that their daughter's husband was no longer working for financial necessity, that he'd moved far beyond the constraints they imagined defined his life. The thought made me smile, which Patricia noticed with a slight frown. She'd probably interpreted my expression as inappropriate levity during a serious discussion about charitable work. Coffee was served in the drawing room, along with brandy that was older than I was, and cigars that William offered with the air of sharing a sacred ritual. I declined both, claiming I had an early meeting the next morning, which was actually true. At 9 o'clock, I would be meeting with the senior management team at Chamberlain Industries to begin what would probably be the most difficult conversation of their professional lives. As the evening wound down, Patricia walked us to the door with the same gracious hospitality she'd shown when we arrived. She kissed Sarah goodbye and shook my hand with the same measured politeness, but I thought I detected something different in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty that had numbed in there earlier. Perhaps she'd noticed my distraction during dinner, or maybe she was simply picking up on the tension that I'd been trying to suppress. "Drive safely," she said as we reached my car. "And Michael, I hope you'll consider what we discussed tonight about the importance of long-term thinking in career planning. It's never too late to reassess one's trajectory and make adjustments that lead to more substantial achievements."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I nodded and thanked her for the advice, then helped Sarah into the passenger seat. As we drove down the circular driveway, I watched the mansion shrink in my rearview mirror, its illuminated windows creating warm squares of light against the dark facade. Tomorrow I would drive through these same gates as the owner of their company, rather than a tolerated guest at their table. The symmetry was almost too perfect to be accidental. Sarah was quiet during the first part of the drive home, but I could feel her studying my profile in the dim light from the dashboard. Finally, she spoke. "You seem different tonight," she said, distracted, but also something else, like you were keeping a secret. I glanced at her, this woman I'd loved for nearly a decade, and felt the weight of what I hadn't told her. The acquisition of Chamberlain Industries had been financed through personal investments and loans that she knew nothing about, coordinated through business relationships she'd never heard me mention. For months I'd been living a double life, maintaining my role as her unremarkable husband, while quietly assembling the resources to buy her family's empire. "Just thinking about work," I said, which was technically true, even if it was completely misleading. "You know how these dinners affect me. All that talk about success and achievement makes me reflective about my own situation." She reached over and squeezed my hand, the same gesture of support she'd offered when we arrived at the mansion. "Don't let them get to you," she said. "I know they can be difficult, but they don't understand what you do or how good you are at it. They measure everything by their own standards, which aren't necessarily the right ones." Her loyalty touched me, even as it highlighted the massive secret I was keeping from her. Sarah had always defended me against her parents' subtle criticisms, had always insisted that their narrow definition of success didn't account for qualities like intelligence, integrity, and dedication. She believed in me even when I struggled to believe in myself, had seen potential that others missed or dismissed. Now that potential was about to be realized in ways that would shock everyone who knew me, including my wife. Tomorrow morning I would stop being the man her parents tolerated and become someone they would have to reckon with on entirely different terms.
The transformation would be jarring for everyone involved, but perhaps most of all for Sarah, who would have to reconcile the husband she thought she knew with the strategic mind that had been operating in shadows for months. We pulled into our own driveway, a modest suburban house that we'd bought 5 years earlier with careful budgeting and a conventional mortgage. The contrast with the Chamberlain estate was stark, but I'd always found something comforting about the human scale of our neighborhood, the way our neighbors waved when they saw us working in the yard, the absence of servants and formal protocols that made simple conversation possible. Inside, Sarah went upstairs to change while I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at our small backyard. Tomorrow would bring changes that neither of us could fully anticipate, challenges that would test our marriage in ways we'd never imagined. I was about to become a different person, or perhaps reveal who I'd always been beneath the surface that everyone found so unremarkable. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Sarah moving around upstairs. I thought about the company I now owned, the employees who didn't yet know their fate was in my hands, the family who had spent the evening dismissing my potential while toasting their own continued success. The irony was complete, but the responsibility was just beginning. I finished my water and headed upstairs, where Sarah was already in bed reading a novel about corporate intrigue that she'd probably find less interesting than the reality unfolding in her own life. She looked up when I entered the room, her expression soft with the kind of contentment that comes from an evening spent with family, even when that family can be challenging. "Thank you for being patient tonight," she said. "I know they can be overwhelming sometimes, but they do care about us in their own way." I kissed her forehead and told her I understood, then went into the bathroom to brush my teeth and prepare for what might be the last normal night of our marriage. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything, not just between me and her parents, but between us as well. The man she'd married had been keeping secrets that would redefine their relationship and force them both to confront assumptions they'd never questioned. As I lay in bed listening to Sarah's breathing slow into sleep, I thought about the documents locked in my office safe, the contracts that made me the majority owner of Chamberlain Industries. I thought about the board meeting scheduled for the following afternoon, where I would officially take control of a company that had been bleeding money for over a year. I thought about the decisions I would need to make, the people whose lives would be affected, the family who would soon discover that their mediocre son-in-law had become their boss. The bedroom was dark except for the red numbers on the digital clock, counting down the hours until my carefully planned revelation would begin. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I would walk into the Chamberlain Industries headquarters not as a visitor or a family connection, but as the new owner. The transformation would be complete, and the man they'd dismissed as unremarkable would finally show them exactly what he was capable of achieving. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of boardrooms and balance sheets, of conversations that would need to be handled with surgical precision, of a future that was about to unfold in ways that no one could predict. When morning came, I would stop being the polite son-in-law who smiled through condescending dinner conversation and become someone who could no longer be overlooked or dismissed. The game was about to change, and for the first time in my life, I would be the one setting the rules. The alarm clock pierced through my restless sleep at 6:30, but I'd been awake for the past hour anyway, staring at the ceiling and rehearsing the conversations that would define the next 24 hours. Sarah stirred beside me, mumbling something about it being too early, but I was already sliding out of bed with the kind of nervous energy that comes before life-changing moments. Today wasn't just another Monday morning, today was the day I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't. I showered with methodical precision, choosing my clothes carefully. The navy suit was my best, though still modest by Chamberlain standards, paired with the tie that Sarah had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. Looking in the mirror, I practiced the expression I would need for the board meeting, something between confident authority and measured restraint. The man staring back at me looked the same as always, but I could feel the difference beneath the surface, like electricity humming through power lines before they're switched on. Sarah was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, making coffee with the automatic movements of someone still half asleep. She'd thrown on her robe, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, looking beautiful in the way that only comes from years of comfortable intimacy. The sight of her made my chest tighten with guilt. In 12 hours, she would learn that her husband had been living a completely different life than the one she thought she knew. "You're up early," she said, handing me a steaming mug. "Big day at work." The question was casual, the kind of routine inquiry that married couples exchange over morning coffee. She had no idea she was asking about the day I would reveal myself as the new owner of her family's company. Something like that, I replied, which was perhaps the most understated response I'd ever given to anything. I kissed her goodbye at the front door, holding the moment longer than usual because I knew that when I came home tonight, everything between us would be different. She noticed the extra intensity and smiled, probably attributing it to pre-meeting nerves. "Good luck today," she said. "Whatever it is, I know you'll handle it perfectly." The drive to Chamberlain Industries headquarters took 45 minutes through downtown traffic, giving me time to review my strategy one final time. The building rose 32 stories above the business district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a monument to corporate ambition. I'd visited it twice before, both times as Sarah's husband attending company social functions where I'd stood in corners making polite conversation with middle managers while the Chamberlain family held court among the real players. The parking garage was familiar from those previous visits, but today I drove past the visitor spaces and headed directly to the executive level. My new parking spot was marked with a simple sign that read "Reserved," anonymous enough to avoid attention but positioned close enough to the elevator to signal importance. I sat in my car for a moment after turning off the engine, taking deep breaths and centering myself for what lay ahead. The lobby was impressive in the way that successful companies designed their public spaces to be, all marble floors and soaring ceilings that made visitors feel appropriately small. A massive bronze sculpture dominated the center of the space, an abstract representation of industrial progress that probably cost more than most people's houses. Behind the reception desk, the Chamberlain Industries logo was etched into granite, suggesting permanence and tradition that the company's actual financial condition couldn't support. Margaret, the receptionist, recognized me from my previous visits and offered the kind of polite smile reserved for family connections. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said. "Are you here for the board meeting?" The question was natural enough, but it carried undertones that she couldn't have intended. In her mind, I was probably attending as Sarah's husband, perhaps invited to observe or offer some minor input on matters that didn't really concern me. She had no way of knowing that I was the reason for the meeting, that the gathering had been called specifically to announce my acquisition of the company. "Yes," I replied simply. "Conference room B, I believe." She nodded and provided directions that I didn't need, having studied the building layout extensively during my due diligence process. The elevator ride to the 28th floor felt longer than usual, each floor passing like a countdown to the moment when my carefully constructed anonymity would end forever. The executive conference room was already half full when I arrived, senior managers and department heads arranging themselves around the massive oak table that dominated the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the city, while oil paintings of company founders watched over the proceedings with stern authority. I recognized most of the faces from organizational charts I'd memorized, though few of them would remember meeting me at company social events. David Kruger, the chief financial officer, was reviewing documents at the head of the table, his expression carrying the kind of grim determination that comes with delivering bad news to people who don't want to hear. Janet Mills, the vice president of operations, was whispering urgently to her assistant while scrolling through messages on her phone. Regional managers filled the remaining seats, their body language suggesting they knew this meeting would be different from the routine quarterly reviews they were accustomed to. I took a seat near the middle of the table, positioning myself where I could observe everyone, without drawing attention. The conversations around me focused on quarterly projections, supply chain disruptions, and client retention challenges, the kind of operational concerns that had been plaguing the company for months. What none of them realized was that these problems were about to become my responsibility rather than theirs. At exactly 9 o'clock, the conference room door opened, and William Chamberlain entered with the measured pace of a man accustomed to commanding attention simply by arriving. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his bearing suggesting confidence that hadn't yet been shaken by the reality of his company's situation. Behind him came Patricia, dressed in a burgundy business suit that emphasized her role as board member and family matriarch. The sight of my in-laws entering the room created a surreal moment of disconnection. 12 hours earlier, I'd been sitting at their dinner table listening to lectures about the importance of substantial achievement and long-term career planning. Now I was about to reveal that their mediocre son-in-law had become their boss through the kind of strategic thinking they'd always assumed was beyond my capabilities. William took his place at the head of the table, while Patricia settled into the chair immediately to his right, the positioning emphasizing their control over the proceedings. The room quieted as everyone focused their attention on the family patriarch, waiting for him to begin what most of them probably assumed would be another rally the troops speech about weathering temporary market challenges. "Thank you all for being here this morning," William began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been leading board meetings for 3 decades. "I know some of you have heard rumors about potential changes in company ownership, and I wanted to address those concerns directly, rather than allow speculation to continue." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches as managers exchanged glances and shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Most of them had probably hoped that the financial difficulties were temporary setbacks that could be resolved through cost-cutting and operational improvements. The prospect of ownership changes suggested that the problems were more serious than they'd been led to believe. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her expression carrying the kind of controlled concern that she'd probably perfected during decades of corporate social events. "The challenges facing our industry are significant," she said, "but they're not insurmountable. However, the board has determined that additional resources and fresh perspectives may be necessary to ensure the company's continued success." I watched the faces around the table as the implications of her words sank in. David Kruger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, while Janet Mills stopped scrolling through her phone and focused entirely on the conversation. The regional managers looked like they were trying to calculate whether their jobs would survive whatever changes were coming. William cleared his throat and reached for a folder that had been placed at his elbow. "After extensive negotiations and careful consideration of all available options, the board has approved the acquisition of Chamberlain Industries by Thomson Strategic Holdings, effective immediately." The silence that followed was profound enough to be physical, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I could see confusion spreading across faces as people processed information that didn't make sense to them. Thomson Strategic Holdings was a name that meant nothing to anyone present, which was exactly how I'd designed it to be. "The new majority owner will be taking an active role in company operations," Patricia continued, her voice maintaining its professional composure despite what must have been considerable personal cost. "We're confident that this partnership will provide the resources and expertise necessary to restore the company to profitability." David Kruger was the first to find his voice. "Who exactly is Thomson Strategic Holdings?" he asked. "I've never heard of them in our industry." William's expression tightened slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "They're a private investment group with extensive experience in operational turnarounds and strategic restructuring. Their principals have requested anonymity during the transition period, but I can assure you that they have the financial resources and industry knowledge necessary to address our current challenges." The explanation was technically accurate but deliberately misleading, designed to provide information without revealing the full truth. Thomson Strategic Holdings was indeed a private investment group, but it consisted entirely of shell companies and financial vehicles that I'd created to obscure my personal involvement in the acquisition. The extensive experience in operational turnarounds belonged to me, accumulated through 15 years of watching companies succeed and fail from the inside. Janet Mills raised her hand tentatively. "What does this mean for current management and staff? Will there be immediate changes to personnel or operations?" Patricia exchanged a glance with William before responding. "The new ownership has indicated that they plan to conduct a comprehensive review of all operations before making any significant changes. Current management will remain in place during the transition period, and any personnel decisions will be made based on performance and strategic fits rather than arbitrary cost-cutting." Again, the response was carefully crafted to provide reassurance without making specific commitment. The truth was that significant changes were inevitable, but I wanted to assess the current situation thoroughly before determining which positions were essential and which were redundant. Some of the people in this room would probably lose their jobs, but others might find themselves with expanded responsibilities and better opportunities for advancement. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, each one revealing the depth of uncertainty and anxiety that the announcement had created. People wanted to know about benefits, job security, reporting structures and strategic direction, but William and Patricia could only provide general assurances and promises of future communication. The reality was that they knew almost as little about my plans as their employees did. Finally, William stood and signaled that the formal presentation was concluding. "I know this news raises many questions that we can't answer immediately," he said. "However, I want to emphasize that this acquisition represents an opportunity rather than a crisis. Chamberlain Industries has a proud history and valuable assets that the new ownership is committed to preserving and strengthening." As people began gathering their materials and preparing to leave, I remained seated watching the interactions around me with new eyes.
These were my employees now, my responsibility and my opportunity. Some of them were probably incompetent or redundant, but others might possess talents and insights that had been overlooked or underutilized by the previous management structure. Patricia approached me as the room was emptying, her expression carrying a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "Michael," she said, "I didn't expect to see you here this morning. Are you attending on behalf of Sarah?" I didn't realize she had business interests in the company. The question provided the perfect opening for my revelation, but I wanted to handle it carefully. Patricia was about to learn that her assessment of my capabilities had been spectacularly wrong, and the shock would be considerable. "Actually," I replied, standing to face her directly, "I'm here as the new majority owner." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge that couldn't be withdrawn or ignored. Patricia's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something approaching horror as the implications of my statement penetrated her consciousness. Behind her, William had frozen in the middle of a conversation with David Kruger, his attention suddenly focused entirely on our exchange. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of careful control that comes from years of social training. "I don't think I understood what you just said." "Thompson Strategic Holdings," I continued, maintaining eye contact and speaking with the quiet confidence that I'd been practicing for months. "That's me. I'm the private investment group that just acquired your company." William moved toward us with the measured pace of someone approaching a potential disaster, his expression cycling through the same progression of emotions that Patricia was experiencing. "Michael," he said, his voice carrying a warning that he probably didn't intend to be audible, "this isn't an appropriate time for jokes." I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a folder containing the signed acquisition documents, placing it on the conference table where both of them could see it clearly. "These are the contracts that transferred majority ownership of Chamberlain Industries to me as of yesterday afternoon," I said. "I signed them about 3 hours before dinner at your house." The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet that had greeted the acquisition announcement. This was the kind of profound stillness that comes when reality shifts so dramatically that normal responses become inadequate. Patricia stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, while William's face cycled through expressions that ranged from confusion to anger to something that might have been respect. David Kruger had noticed the tension and drifted closer, his financial background making him naturally curious about any conversation involving ownership documents. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he was prepared to handle whatever crisis might be developing. William gestured toward me with a movement that seemed to require considerable effort. "David, I'd like you to meet Michael Thompson, the new majority owner of Chamberlain Industries. He's also my son-in-law." The revelation hit David like a physical blow, his expression shifting from professional concern to complete bewilderment. "Your son-in-law?" he repeated, as if the words might make more sense the second time. "The one who works in logistics, the one who worked in logistics," I corrected gently. "As of this morning I work here." Patricia had been studying the acquisition documents with the intensity of someone searching for evidence of fraud or forgery. When she finally looked up, her expression carried a mixture of emotions that I couldn't entirely decode. "How?" she asked, the single word containing volumes of disbelief and confusion. The question deserved a complete answer, but this wasn't the appropriate venue for the kind of detailed explanation that would satisfy her curiosity. "I've been planning this acquisition for over a year," I said. "The logistics industry gave me insights into your operational challenges and market position that allowed me to structure a deal that worked for everyone involved." William found his voice again, though it carried a strain that hadn't been there earlier. "Where did you get the capital for an acquisition of this size?"
Logistics managers don't typically have access to that kind of investment funding. The question revealed one of the fundamental assumptions that had made my strategy possible. William couldn't conceive of someone in my position accumulating the resources necessary to acquire his company because he'd never bothered to understand how my career had actually developed. Private investors, I replied, which was technically true even though the private investors were primarily me. People who saw the same opportunity that I did. Patricia was still processing the basic reality of the situation, her social training struggling to adapt to circumstances that her experience hadn't prepared her for. "Does Sarah know?" she asked, the question carrying implications that extended far beyond simple curiosity. "Not yet," I admitted. I wanted to handle the business transition first, then discuss the personal implications with her privately. The admission seemed to restore some of Patricia's equilibrium, providing her with something concrete to focus on amid the swirling confusion. "You made a major business decision without consulting your wife?" she asked, her tone suggesting that this was perhaps more shocking than the acquisition itself. "I made an investment decision based on market analysis and financial projections," I corrected. "The personal dynamics are separate considerations that need to be handled appropriately." David Kruger had been listening to our exchange with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a puzzle that didn't make sense. "Can we step back for a moment?" he asked. "I need to understand the practical implications of this situation. What are your immediate plans for company operations?" The question redirected the conversation toward business concerns rather than family drama, which was exactly what I needed. "Complete operational review over the next 30 days, I replied. "Analysis of all current contracts, assessment of personnel efficiency, evaluation of asset utilization, and development of a strategic plan for returning to profitability." William's expression shifted slightly as he recognized the language of someone who actually understood business operations. "You sound like you've done this before," he said, the comment carrying a note of grudging respect. "I've been studying this company for over a year," I replied. "I know where the problems are and I have ideas about how to fix them. Whether those ideas work will depend on execution and market conditions, but I'm confident about the basic strategy." Patricia had been quiet during this exchange, but I could see her mind working as she tried to reconcile the man she'd known as her unremarkable son-in-law with the person who had just revealed himself as her new boss. "This is why you seemed different last night," she said finally. "You already knew." I knew, I confirmed, and I spent dinner listening to lectures about the importance of substantial achievement while sitting on documents that proved I'd already achieved more than you realized was possible. The words carried more edge than I'd intended, but the irony had been building pressure for months and needed release. William's eyes narrowed slightly as he recognized the implicit criticism, while Patricia's expression hardened in response to what she correctly interpreted as a challenge to their previous dismissiveness. "I think," William said carefully, "that we need to schedule a more comprehensive discussion about your plans and expectations. This is obviously a significant development that affects everyone in the family, not just the company." I nodded agreement, recognizing that this initial revelation was only the beginning of much longer and more difficult conversations. "I'd suggest we start with a thorough review of the company's current financial position," I said. "Once we understand exactly where things stand operationally, we can discuss the strategic changes that will be necessary." David Kruger cleared his throat diplomatically. "Should I prepare a complete financial briefing for later this week? I assume you'll want to review all the details that weren't included in the acquisition documents." "This afternoon," I replied. "I want to understand the complete picture before making any announcements to the broader organization." The speed of my timeline seemed to surprise everyone, but I'd been planning this transition for months and didn't want to waste time on extended orientation periods. Every day that passed without decisive action was another day of declining performance and increasing losses. Patricia gathered her composure with visible effort, reasserting the social control that had served her throughout decades of corporate and family leadership. "I think it would be appropriate for all of us to take some time to process this information before making any hasty decisions," she said. "Major changes require careful consideration and broad consultation." The suggestion was reasonable on its surface, but I recognized it as an attempt to slow down the transition and maintain some version of the existing power structure. "The market doesn't wait for family adjustments," I replied. "The company has been losing money for 18 months and every week of delay makes the turnaround more difficult." William's expression shifted as he heard his company's problems described with the kind of blunt accuracy that he'd probably been avoiding in his own assessments. 18 months might be an exaggeration, he said. We've faced some challenges, but the fundamentals remain strong. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew another folder, this one containing financial analysis that I'd compiled using publicly available information and industry contacts. Revenue down 38%, profit margins negative for the past 2 quarters, debt service consuming 62% of operating income, I said, reading from documents that I'd memorized weeks earlier. Those aren't challenges, they're existential threats. The numbers hit the room like physical blows, each statistic stripping away another layer of the comfortable denial that had allowed the family to maintain their lifestyle while their company collapsed around them. David Kruger's expression suggested that my analysis was accurate, while William and Patricia looked like they were hearing some of these figures for the first time. Where did you get this information? Patricia asked, her voice carrying a note of accusation. Industry sources, supplier reports, customer feedback, credit analysis, market research, I replied. Most of it is available if you know where to look and how to interpret it. The logistics industry is closely connected to manufacturing, and information flows pretty freely among people who work with the same suppliers and customers. William sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated revelations. You've been investigating us, he said, the statement carrying implications that extended beyond simple business research. I've been evaluating an investment opportunity, I corrected. The personal connections made the research easier, but the analysis was based on objective financial and operational data. The distinction was important because it established my actions as legitimate business strategy rather than family espionage. But I could see that the explanation wasn't entirely satisfying to people who were still struggling to understand how their mediocre son-in-law had become their business superior. Janet Mills appeared in the doorway of the conference room, her expression suggesting that she'd been waiting for an appropriate moment to interrupt. I'm sorry to intrude, she said, but the production managers are asking about this afternoon's scheduling meeting. Should we proceed as planned, or do you want to postpone given the ownership announcement? The question forced everyone to confront the practical reality that the company needed to continue operating regardless of family drama or personal adjustments. I looked around the room, noting the expressions of uncertainty and anxiety that my revelation had created, then made my first executive decision as the new owner. The meeting proceeds as scheduled, I said, but I'll be attending as the new owner rather than an observer. I want to understand current production challenges and assess our operational efficiency firsthand. Janet nodded and withdrew, but I could see the speculation in her expression as she processed the implications of my statement. Within an hour, everyone in the building would know that the quiet son-in-law who'd attended a few social functions was actually their new boss. Patricia stood and gathered her papers with movements that seemed to require more effort than usual. I need some time to absorb all of this, she said. The implications for the family are considerable, and I don't think any of us were prepared for this kind of development. William remained seated, staring at the acquisition documents as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. 30 years, he said quietly. I built this company for 30 years and my son-in-law buys it out from under me without saying a word. The pain in his voice was genuine, and I felt an unexpected stab of sympathy for the man who'd spent the previous evening lecturing me about the importance of substantial achievement. You built something worth saving, I said. That's why I bought it instead of letting it collapse. The company has problems, but it also has assets and capabilities that can be restored with the right strategy. He looked up at me with an expression that I couldn't entirely read. And you think you have the right strategy? I think I have a different strategy, I replied. Whether it's right will depend on execution and market response, but it's based on a clear understanding of where the problems are and what needs to be changed. David Kruger had been taking notes throughout our conversation, his financial training making him focus on practical considerations rather than emotional responses. Should I cancel the quarterly board meeting scheduled for next Friday? He asked. I assume the agenda will need to be completely revised given the change in ownership. I considered the question, weighing the advantages of moving quickly against the benefits of allowing time for adjustment. Keep the meeting, I decided, but revise the agenda to focus on strategic planning rather than quarterly reviews. I want to present a comprehensive turnaround plan to the board and get their input before implementing major changes. The timeline was aggressive, but I'd been developing the turnaround plan for months and was ready to move into implementation mode. The company couldn't afford extended transition periods or gradual adjustments. Either we moved quickly and decisively, or we'd be managing a controlled decline rather than an actual recovery.
Patricia paused at the door of the conference room, turning back to face me with an expression that carried a mixture of emotions I couldn't entirely decode. "Sarah is going to be devastated when she learns that you've been keeping this from her," she said. "Marriage requires honesty and transparency, qualities that seem to have been absent from your recent decision-making." The criticism stung because it contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. I had been dishonest with Sarah, not just about the acquisition but about the entire trajectory of my career development over the past year. "Some decisions require confidentiality until they're complete," I replied. "I'll discuss the situation with Sarah tonight and I'll take full responsibility for not involving her in the planning process." William stood slowly, his movements suggesting that the morning's revelations had aged him considerably. "I suppose we should call an emergency board meeting for this afternoon," he said. "The other board members need to be informed about the change in ownership and they'll want to meet with you directly." I nodded agreement, though I suspected that the board meeting would be even more challenging than this morning's revelation. The other board members were longtime friends and business associates of the Chamberlain family, people who would probably be even less prepared to accept me as their new majority owner. As William and Patricia left the conference room, I remained seated at the massive oak table, surrounded by the oil paintings of company founders and the panoramic view of the city skyline. For the first time since signing the acquisition documents, I was alone with the full weight of what I'd accomplished and the enormity of the challenges that lay ahead. Owning Chamberlain Industries was only the beginning. Actually turning the company around would require decisions that would affect hundreds of employees, multiple communities, and a family that was still struggling to understand how their world had been turned upside down by someone they'd consistently underestimated. I pulled out my phone and called my assistant, a competent woman named Rebecca, who'd been handling my scheduling and administrative needs for the past 3 years. "Rebecca," I said when she answered, "I need you to clear my calendar for the rest of the week and schedule meetings with the CFO, the head of operations, and all department managers. Also arrange for a complete financial audit and operational assessment to begin immediately." "Of course," she replied, though I could hear the curiosity in her voice. "Should I ask what this is regarding?" "Career change," I said, which was perhaps the most understated way possible to describe becoming the owner of a major corporation. "I'll explain everything when I see you this afternoon." After ending the call, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city where I'd spent my entire career learning how businesses really operated. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably starting her volunteer shift at the Children's Hospital, completely unaware that her husband had just revealed himself as the new owner of her family's company. Tonight I would have to explain not just what I'd done but who I really was beneath the surface that everyone had found so unremarkable. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual, each mile giving me more time to rehearse conversations that would reshape my marriage forever. The dashboard clock showed 7:45, which meant Sarah would already be home from her volunteer shift, probably cooking dinner and wondering why I hadn't answered her texts from earlier in the day. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from board members, managers, and family members, but I'd ignored them all. Tonight belonged to Sarah, and she deserved to hear the truth from me before it reached her through other channels. Our house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything felt different as I pulled into the driveway. The modest suburban home that had always represented our careful financial planning and middle-class aspirations now seemed like a deliberate disguise, a way of hiding in plain sight while I accumulated the resources to buy her family's empire. The yellow porch light cast the same warm glow it always did, but I wondered if Sarah would ever see it the same way again after learning who her husband really was. I sat in the car for several minutes watching the silhouette of her moving past the kitchen window, probably preparing the kind of simple meal that we'd shared thousands of times during our marriage. The normalcy of the scene made my deception feel even more profound. For over a year I'd been planning the acquisition of Chamberlain Industries while maintaining the facade of being her unremarkable husband who worked in logistics and worried about mortgage payments. The front door opened before I reached it, Sarah appearing with a dish towel in her hands and a smile that carried just a hint of concern. "There you are," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "I was starting to worry. You missed dinner, and you didn't answer any of my messages."
The guilt hit me immediately, not just for missing dinner but for the months of carefully constructed lies that had made this moment necessary. "Sorry," I said, kissing her cheek and trying to project normalcy despite the tension coiled in my chest. "Long day at work. We need to talk." Something in my tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the conversation ahead because her expression shifted from mild concern to focused attention. "Is everything okay?" she asked, following me into the living room where we'd had every important conversation of our marriage. "We had," she asked. "The sebingmuksuber first storifsino but nonamer sil but noe bentomen est." I gestured for her to sit on the couch while I remained standing, pacing slightly as I tried to find the right words to begin. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything between us," I said. "I've been keeping something from you for over a year, something major that affects our entire—" Her face went pale and I could see her mind immediately jumping to the worst possible explanations. "Are you having an affair?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said quickly, sitting down beside her and taking her hands in mine. "Nothing like that. This is about work, about money, about your family's company." The confusion that replaced her fear was almost harder to watch. "I don't understand," she said. "What does your job have to do with my parents' business?" I took a deep breath and committed to the revelation that would end my double life forever. "This morning I attended a board meeting at Chamberlain Industries, not as your husband, not as a guest, but as the new majority owner. I bought your family's company." The words hung in the air between us like a barrier that couldn't be crossed or removed. Sarah stared at me with the kind of complete incomprehension that comes when reality shifts so dramatically that normal responses become inadequate. "That's not possible," she said finally. "You work for a logistics company. We barely have enough money for a vacation, let alone buying a corporation." I reached for the briefcase I'd brought home, withdrawing the same acquisition documents that I'd shown her parents that morning. "Thompson Strategic Holdings," I said, pointing to the signature line. "That's me. That's the company I created to acquire Chamberlain Industries." She took the documents with trembling hands, scanning the legal language as if she might find evidence that this was all an elaborate joke. "Michael Thompson," she read aloud, her voice carrying the kind of careful precision that people use when they're trying to maintain control. "You're Michael Thompson. I've been Michael Thompson all along," I said gently. "What changed is that I stopped hiding what I was capable of achieving." The tears came suddenly, not the angry tears that I'd been expecting, but the confused, hurt tears of someone whose entire understanding of her life had just been shattered. "How?" she asked, the single word carrying years of accumulated trust and assumptions. "How is this possible?" I moved closer to her on the couch, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to feel intrusive. "For the past year and a half I've been using my position in logistics to analyze the manufacturing industry," I explained. "I identified companies that were undervalued or struggling, and I developed strategies for turning them around. Your family's company was the perfect opportunity." "With what money?" she demanded, her voice rising as the practical implications of my revelation began to sink in. "We don't have millions of dollars. We worry about our mortgage payments and car repairs and whether we can afford to replace the dishwasher." "Private investors," I said, using the same explanation I'd given her parents. "People who believed in my analysis and were willing to fund the acquisition in exchange for equity stakes." The explanation was technically true but deliberately incomplete. Most of the private investors were actually me, using savings and investments that I'd accumulated over years of careful financial planning that Sarah hadn't fully understood. I'd also leveraged relationships from my logistics career, calling in favors and partnerships that she'd never heard me mention. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression that I couldn't entirely decode. "You've been lying to me for over a year," she said. "Not just about the money, but about who you are, what you're doing, what you're planning. How am I supposed to trust anything you tell me now?" The question struck at the heart of everything I'd been dreading about this conversation. "I wasn't lying about who I am," I said carefully. "I was protecting a business strategy that required confidentiality. The acquisition had to remain secret until it was complete, or your parents would have found ways to block it. So you chose the business over our marriage," she said, her voice carrying a bitter edge that I'd never heard before. "You decided that making money was more important than being honest with your wife." "I chose to create opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise," I replied. "Your family's company was failing. In 6 months it would have been bankrupt, and your parents would have lost everything they'd built over 30 years. I saved it. She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at our quiet suburban street. You saved it for yourself, she said, without turning around. Don't pretend this was some noble gesture to help my family. You saw an opportunity to make money, and you took it regardless of the personal cost. The accusation was partially fair, and I struggled to find a response that was both honest and defensive. It was both, I admitted. I saw an opportunity that could benefit everyone involved, but yes, I also saw it as a way to prove that I was capable of more than your parents thought possible. She turned to face me, her expression carrying a mixture of hurt and anger that made my chest tighten. Prove to whom? She asked. To them or to yourself? The question forced me to confront motivations that I'd been avoiding examining too closely. Maybe both, I said. I've spent 8 years listening to subtle reminders that I'm not good enough for their daughter, that I lack the ambition and capability to achieve anything substantial. Part of me wanted to show them exactly what I was capable of when I stopped playing by their rules. So our marriage became a prop in your revenge fantasy against my parents, she said, her voice rising again. 8 years of building a life together, and you were just waiting for the right moment to prove that you're smarter than everyone else. That's not fair, I said, standing to face her directly. I love you, I've always loved you. The acquisition doesn't change that, everything changes that, she replied, her voice breaking slightly. You made a decision that affects our entire future without consulting me. You've been living a double life for over a year, keeping secrets that would have changed how I understood everything about our relationship. The tears were flowing freely now, and I felt a desperate urge to comfort her, to find some way to bridge the gap that my revelation had created between us. I wanted to tell you, I said. There were dozens of times when I almost explained what I was planning, but the business required confidentiality, and I didn't want to put you in a position where you had to choose between supporting me and remaining loyal to your family. So you made the choice for me, she said. You decided that I couldn't be trusted with the truth about my own husband's life. The accusation was accurate enough to be painful, and I struggled to find a defense that didn't sound like rationalization. I was trying to protect everyone involved, I said. You, your parents, the company, the employees. If the acquisition had failed, if your parents had found a way to block it, everyone would have been worse off. Sarah walked back to the couch and picked up the acquisition documents, studying them again as if she might find different information the second time. How much money are we talking about? She asked. What's our actual financial situation? The question forced me to confront another layer of deception that I'd been maintaining. The company cost $47 million to acquire, I said. Most of that was financed through investor partnerships and debt instruments, but I personally invested about $12 million. She looked up at me with an expression of complete shock. $12 million, she repeated. We have $12 million? We have assets worth considerably more than that, I corrected. Property investments, stock portfolios, business partnerships that I've been developing for years. The logistics job was never our primary source of income. It was cover for other activities that were more lucrative. The revelation seemed to stagger her and she sat down heavily on the couch. I don't know who you are, she said quietly. The man I married worked in logistics and worried about money and drove a used car and shopped at discount stores. Who is this person who has millions of dollars and buys corporations and lives secret lives? I'm the same person, I said, sitting beside her again. I just stopped limiting myself to other people's expectations about what I was capable of achieving. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the acquisition documents as if they contained answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. My parents must be devastated, she said finally. 30 years of building something and their son-in-law buys it out from under them. They're shocked, I admitted, but the company was failing. In 6 months it would have been worthless. At least this way they retain some equity and the possibility of recovery. How generous of you, she said, her voice carrying a sarcasm that I'd never heard from her before. Buying their life's work and letting them keep some equity. I'm sure they're grateful. The conversation was spiraling into territory that felt dangerous, and I searched for a way to redirect it toward more constructive ground. The company has problems that can be fixed, I said. With the right strategy and sufficient resources, it can be profitable again. That's good for everyone, including your parents. And you're the person with the right strategy, she asked. The logistics manager who's been hiding millions of dollars and planning corporate acquisitions in his spare time. I'm the person who's been studying this industry for 15 years, I replied. I know where the inefficiencies are, what the market demands, and how to structure operations for maximum profitability. The logistics background gave me insights that traditional business consultants don't have. Sarah stood and walked to the kitchen, returning with a glass of water that she drank slowly while studying my face. What happens now? She asked. Do we move into a mansion? Do I quit my volunteer work and become a corporate wife? Do we pretend that this morning I was married to a middle manager and tonight I'm married to a millionaire? The questions highlighted practical concerns that I'd been avoiding thinking about too carefully. Nothing has to change immediately, I said. We can stay in this house if you want, maintain the same lifestyle, keep the same routines. The money doesn't have to define who we are. The money already defines who you are, she replied. It's defined who you've been for years, apparently. I just didn't know it. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, creating physical distance that reflected the emotional chasm my revelation had opened between us. Sarah, I said, I know this is overwhelming, but we can work through it. We can figure out how to integrate this new reality with the life we've built together. Can we? She asked. Because right now I feel like I've been married to a stranger for 8 years. How do I know what else you've been hiding? How do I know who you really are underneath all the secrets and strategies and carefully planned deceptions? The question struck at my deepest fears about this moment, the possibility that my revelation would destroy not just Sarah's trust but her love for the person she thought she'd married. I'm still the same person who fell in love with you in college, I said. I'm still the person who proposed on the beach in Myrtle Beach and cried when your grandmother died and stayed up all night when you had pneumonia. The business activities don't change the fundamental aspects of who I am, don't they? She asked. Because the person I fell in love with was honest and straightforward and didn't keep major secrets. The person I married valued our partnership and made important decisions together with me. This person you're describing sounds like someone who's been manipulating everyone around him for years. The word manipulating hit like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the possibility that my strategic thinking might be interpreted as betrayal by the people closest to me. I wasn't manipulating you, I said. I was building something that would benefit both of us without telling me, she replied, without asking for my input or consideration. You decided unilaterally that you knew what was best for everyone involved, and you executed your plan regardless of how it might affect the people who trusted you. I struggled to find a response that acknowledged the validity of her concerns while defending the necessity of my approach. Some opportunities require confidentiality, I said. If I'd discussed the acquisition openly, if your parents had learned about it before the contracts were signed, they would have found ways to prevent it. The company would have continued declining until it collapsed completely. So you saved everyone from themselves, she said, her voice carrying the kind of bitter edge that suggested she found my reasoning unconvincing. How fortunate that you were there to make all the difficult decisions that the rest of us were too naive or stupid to handle properly. The conversation was deteriorating into the kind of argument that could permanently damage our relationship, and I searched desperately for a way to redirect it toward more constructive territory. I'm not saying I handled everything perfectly, I admitted. Maybe I should have found a way to include you in the planning process, but the fundamental decision was sound, and the results will benefit everyone involved. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at our suburban street while processing everything I'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness that was harder to hear than anger would have been. I need time to think about all of this, she said. I need space to figure out who you really are, and whether the person I thought I married ever actually existed. The request for space felt like a physical blow, but I recognized that pushing for immediate resolution would probably make things worse. Of course, I said. Take whatever time you need. But Sarah, please remember that I love you and nothing about the business changes that. Everything about the business changes that, she replied. Love requires honesty and trust, and you've demonstrated that you're capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions for extended periods of time. How am I supposed to believe that anything you tell me now is true? The question hung in the air between us like an indictment that I couldn't answer satisfactorily. I guess you'll have to decide whether you can forgive me for keeping this secret, I said, and whether you can accept that I did it because I thought it was necessary, not because I wanted to deceive you. She nodded slowly, but I could see in her expression that forgiveness wasn't something that would come easily or quickly. I'm going to stay at my sister's house tonight, she said. I need some distance to process all of this without feeling like I have to take care of your emotions while I'm trying to understand my own. The announcement that she was leaving, even temporarily, felt like confirmation of my worst fears about this conversation. Sarah, I said, please don't make any permanent decisions based on how you feel right now. This is shocking, I understand that, but it doesn't have to destroy what we've built together. What we've built together? She asked, her voice rising again. I thought we built a marriage based on honesty and partnership. You apparently built an elaborate fiction designed to hide your real life from the person closest to you. I'm not sure we built the same thing at all. She went upstairs to pack a bag while I sat in the living room surrounded by the familiar furniture and decorations that had always represented our shared life. Everything looked the same, but I could feel the fundamental shift that my revelation had created. The home we built together now felt like a stage set, a carefully constructed illusion that had hidden the truth about who I really was. When Sarah came back downstairs with her overnight bag, she paused at the front door and looked back at me with an expression that I couldn't entirely read. I don't know how long I'll need, she said, but I can't pretend that nothing has changed. You're not the person I thought I married, and I need to figure out whether I can love the person you actually are. After she left, I sat alone in our house, surrounded by the silence that her absence had created. The acquisition of Chamberlain Industries was complete, the revelation was finished, and the transformation that I'd been planning for over a year was finally accomplished. But the cost was higher than I'd anticipated, and I wasn't sure whether the success I'd achieved was worth the damage it had caused to the relationship that mattered most to me. My phone buzzed with messages from board members, employees, and family members who wanted to discuss the implications of the acquisition, but I ignored them all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, decisions that would affect hundreds of people and multiple communities. Tonight belonged to the recognition that proving my capabilities had come at the cost of losing the person whose opinion mattered most. The house felt different without Sarah, not just empty but somehow smaller, as if her absence had reduced its capacity to contain the life we'd built together. I walked through rooms that had always represented our shared aspirations and careful financial planning, but now they seemed like artifacts from a previous life, reminders of a time when I'd been content to be the person everyone thought I was rather than the person I was capable of becoming. The next morning brought phone calls from reporters who'd learned about the acquisition, investors who wanted to discuss partnership opportunities, and employees who needed guidance about the company's future direction. But the call that mattered most came from Sarah's sister, who wanted to discuss the impact of my revelation on their family relationships. She's devastated, Jennifer said without preamble, not just about the secrets but about what it means for her relationship with our parents. You've put her in an impossible position. The observation forced me to confront consequences that I'd been avoiding thinking about too carefully. Sarah's relationship with her family had always been complicated by their tendency to judge her choices, particularly her decision to marry someone they considered beneath their social standards. My acquisition of their company had vindicated their concerns while simultaneously making their criticisms irrelevant. I know, I admitted, I didn't fully consider how the revelation would affect her position within the family dynamic. Did you consider anything beyond your own desire to prove that you're smarter than everyone else? Jennifer asked, her voice carrying an edge of protective anger. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you sacrificed your marriage to win an argument with people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered to you anyway. The accusation was harsh, but not entirely unfair, and I struggled to find a defense that didn't sound like rationalization. The company was failing, I said. Someone needed to take action before it collapsed completely. So you appointed yourself as savior, she replied. How convenient that saving the company also happened to serve your need to demonstrate your superiority over people who'd underestimated you. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Jennifer alternating between anger at my deception and concern for her sister's emotional well-being. By the time we finished talking, I understood that Sarah's decision to leave wasn't just about processing my revelation, it was about choosing between supporting her husband and maintaining relationships with family members who felt betrayed by my strategic acquisition of their life's work. 3 days later, I received a letter from Sarah's attorney requesting a separation agreement that would allow her to maintain financial independence while we worked through the personal implications of my business activities. The letter was professional and courteous, but it represented the formalization of what my revelation had created, a fundamental rupture in our relationship that might not be repairable. The acquisition of Chamberlain Industries was complete, the company was beginning its transformation under my leadership, and I had achieved everything I'd planned during months of careful strategy and execution. But sitting alone in our house, reading legal documents that outlined the dissolution of our shared life, I wondered whether proving my capabilities had been worth the cost of losing the person whose love and respect had always mattered more than anyone else's recognition of my achievements. The man who'd been dismissed as mediocre had become the owner of a major corporation, but the victory felt hollow without someone to share it with. Success, I was learning, meant nothing if it came at the cost of the relationships that made life meaningful. The business could be saved, but the marriage that had anchored my personal life might be beyond recovery. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.